Warning, this podcast contains violence, sexuality, gore, and other horrible and disturbing things. Listener discretion is advised. Also, the hosts of this venture are ignorant dipshits, so please do not take anything they say as fact. And enjoy the show.
Now, are you sitting comfortably? Good. Then we'll begin.
Today we had 15 homicides and 63 violent crimes, as if that's the way it's supposed to be.
The atoms in your left hand probably came from a different star than your right hand.
It is our basic human right to be fuck up.
A second plane now has crashed into the other tower of the World Trade Center.
Putting chemicals in the water that turn the friggin' frogs gay.
The defendant shall be incarcerated for the rest of her natural life with no possibility of parole.
You are not machines. You are not cattle. You are men.
We were somewhere around Barstow, on the edge of the desert, when the drugs began to take hold.
Occultae Veritatis.
Welcome to Occultae Veritatis. I am Ood Gallifrey.
Sage Murray.
Leon Filger.
And in studio with us,
Richard Bigley.
Sorry, and Carly.
That was an awkward pause.
That's okay, we still love you.
It's all good. So, I don't know.
It's because Ood switched it up and went from right to left instead of left to right.
Yeah.
Oh, shit, I did.
I always go second, no matter who is doing it.
I always try to go third unless I'm hosting and then first.
Yeah, and I always go second unless I'm first.
I'm pretty versatile.
That is some real cheap-looking vodka.
Oh,
it is. It is in like a literal like emoji bottle.
We were about to check out of the liquor store, and Daniel had the podcast credit card, and she was like, "We need to get a couple of those." I'm like, "What?" She's like, "Emoji vodkas." I'm like, "Holy shit!"
They look also like you could put they look like they could be baubles like on Christmas trees.
Yeah.
Oh, I know what you mean. Yeah,
like
yeah.
totally make it into whoa.
That's some wild pouring there.
She means well.
I look at
Where's
them.
Bigley's sponge?
She's aerating it. God. We learned about aeration last episode.
Yeah, didn't we have to gargle our coffee?
Yeah.
We gargle our coffee.
So we may as well move into the poison.
So, what's your poison?
Oh, you don't drink alcohol. Sorry,
But I mean, I'll taste it.
just take like a tiny little sip. It tastes like juice.
If you want to start drinking, start with that.
Well, I used to drink. That's how I don't remember my friend who I have a matching tattoo with.
Oh, that's fair.
No, the tattoo definitely came after the not remembering the friend. No, I was Jaeger.
Jaeger.
It's a poison.
It is a poison.
Terrible.
/ a cough syrup.
Yeah, and it coats your throat. That's for sure.
Yep.
I could use some Jaeger
Help
right
yourself
now.
to whatever you need.
I don't know, these vodka bottles kind of remind me of light bulbs, especially with the caps on them.
Yeah, they
They
look
do exactly. They look like those new LED bulbs that you can put in your bathroom.
They're like glass even.
Oh,
I
whoa.
thought it was plastic, but this is actually
Dude.
glass.
They cost $4.99 a piece.
Holy shit.
That's so expensive.
Where'd you get them?
Just from the Sobeys liquor store on Preston.
As long as it's not co-op.
Oh, no.
Co-op.
I would not support co-op
Yeah,
at this time.
one for you. Duh. Not for me. It's for you.
It's okay. We can redistribute the wealth. It's all good.
So we're drinking emoji vodka. I'm not really sure what the brand is. And Sunripe orange juice. It says 100% juice, no sugar added.
Is there pulp?
And based on
No
the
pulp.
sip, there's no pulp.
No pulp. Right on.
So this is kind of disappointing because I'm a big fan of orange
Dude,
juice.
I will
come
give you a
on.
fucking bucket of pulp.
You can give me the
Hello.
bucket of pulp.
See,
Hate
the
pulp.
thing is, the no pulp ones, I'm like, and then the ones that have pulp, it seems like they take the pulp out of the no pulp ones.
Yes, they do, and they ultra pulp it.
Ultra pulp it, and it's like I
disgusting.
just want a normal amount of pulp in my orange juice.
Yeah.
It's
Regular
heaven in
pulp.
my mouth.
Like as if I pulped an orange. Like
I also don't
that
like
amount.
crunchy. Crunchy peanut butter is the same for me. I need smooth.
You go, that's something I've noticed in Europe, in all the grocery stores in the big cities, they all have orange juicing machines.
Oh.
And that shit is legit because they you're drinking oranges and it takes 3 or 4 oranges to fill up that bottle. So you're like, man.
They used to have one of those in the Safeway in Cumberland Square.
Did they?
Yeah. They had navel oranges all stacked up, and the thing was so fucking loud that you couldn't stand anywhere near the produce department while it was running. I imagine that's why they got rid of it.
Yes. I believe we did screwdrivers one time before. We did a California orange juice with good Russian vodka for our Apollo Soyuz. How do you say it?
Apollo Soyuz
episode, because it was a meeting of Russian vodka and California. This is a much less. This was a $1.99 thing of orange juice, and this was a $4.99 thing of vodka. Enough
with an emoji.
And also, the 2 emojis I got were the only recognizable ones. Like the kissy face and there's a heart face. The rest of them I couldn't find them on my phone. They weren't recognizable emojis. They kind of like winged it.
Was there a Poomoji?
No, unfortunately not. I would have got the Poomoji.
I wouldn't have drank it.
I would have.
See, but that would have been like a really cool shaped bottle.
Yeah.
Would you have?
Which end do you drink from?
I was just gonna say, do they put this? But then you like ruin the swirl, so you would have to be on the bottom.
There's a reason it's not. That's why no one could decide.
Emo vodka, emodka.
Emodka. Okay.
Thank you to the good folks at Emodka.
I mean, it's
emotional vodka.
All vodka's pretty emotional for me, I think. So.
It's the end of a long recording night, so I'm not sure if I'm drunk, high, and tired, or if this actually tastes good. But you know what?
It's fine.
Yeah.
It's a screwdriver.
Yeah.
But if you order it as a vodka orange, it costs less than a premium cocktail at some bars.
Good.
Never ask for a screwdriver. Always ask for vodka orange. And they'll say screwdriver, and you say no, vodka orange. And then they ring it in as something less. It's just a shot of vodka then.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Alrighty.
Good
That
tip.
would make
Thanks.
Tip
sense.
from Leon Filger. It's dirty screwdriver.
On that note, I give it a 10 out of 10. It's fantastic. I love this beverage. I took some Tums before I got here, so the acid's not going to melt my stomach, and I'm in a good mood.
Bravo.
10 out of 10.
Yeah.
Tastes like white people.
I'm glad you guys are all enjoying your white people drinks.
Super white people drink.
I'm
really
drinking
good.
fresh, clean water from the tap. So
That's also white
pretty
people.
white people.
I think Saskatoon tap water isn't that bad, actually.
No, Saskatoon tap water is good.
That's
No,
fine.
Swift Current tap water is atrocious.
Yeah, Swift Current
I was
tap
there
water
the
is
other day, and
disgusting.
it's terrible.
According to my dad, the best tap water in Saskatchewan is in Melville.
It's actually Radisson.
Radisson.
Yeah, they have an award for it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, they have it on their sign, don't they?
They do, yeah. Best tap water in North America.
Oh, claim to fame.
Yeah.
There's actually professional like water tasters who
came
do
around.
like how you do like wine tasting or beer tasting or scotch tasting. They actually do water tasting.
Sign
Like, this
me
is a
up for
thing.
that.
White privilege. Joining us now from New York is Michael Skolnick, the editor-in-chief of globalgrind.com. Michael, thank you. Do you agree that there is such a thing, and we've been hearing a lot about it now, as white privilege? Is that real?
Of course it's real, and I'm white, and I have it. I can walk in the street in New York City and put my hand out, and no taxi will pass me by. I can walk in the street, and no woman's going to grab their purse in fear of me. I can walk into a restaurant, no one's going to ask me to pay before I eat. I can walk through my neighborhood, and no one's going to call 911 and say I look suspicious. I wore a hoodie, I wore a pair of jeans, and a pair of white tennis shoes this weekend, as I do every weekend, and no one's ever going to stop and say, hey, that guy looks suspicious. And it's for one reason and one reason only, because I'm white. And Don, and further, let me say one last thing, Don. Furthermore, I have the privilege to never look suspicious. That's an incredible privilege to have. I will never look suspicious to anyone, regardless of what I'm wearing, because of my skin color.
Where did this concept of white privilege come from?
Well, I think the idea of white privilege comes from is white people have been in power for hundreds and hundreds of years. And because white people, we've been in power for hundreds and hundreds of years, we think that we have the right to do whatever we want. I look at a young man like Trayvon walking through his neighborhood, his father's neighborhood, with a bag of Skittles and a can of iced tea, and another man looks at him, regardless of his skin color, that young black men look suspicious because of the color of their skin is wrong.
Is it something that's innate? People say, well, you don't know. I've had many women say, you don't know what it's like to be a woman, Don, because you're not a woman. You don't know what it's like to be black because you're not black, or white because you're not white. Is it something that's so innate and so pervasive that people just don't even understand that there is something as the concept of white privilege and that they're in it?
Yeah, well, I wrote a piece on globalgrind.com called White People You'll Never Look Suspicious Like Trayvon Martin. The reason why I wrote it is because as a white person, we have to begin to understand I don't feel guilty for being white. I'm not ashamed of being white. It was the hand that I was dealt. It was the card that came out of the deck. It's what I got. But when I got that, when I was lucky enough to be a man, to be white, to be an American, I got choices to make. The choices that I'm going to make is I'm not going to be quiet. I'm not going to watch a kid get shot in the chest and just be quiet. 3 weeks ago, when Joseph Kony, when that movement started, all my white friends were loud and screaming and tweeting and Facebooking and emailing. Did you hear about Joseph Kony? When a 17-year-old black kid was killed in our country, white people were just quiet. And Donna, it was you. It was you. It was Charles Blow. It was Melissa Harris Perry on MSNBC. It was black commentators who were talking about it. And I said, why did they have to talk about it? Why can't white people stand up and say, this is just as wrong?
Yeah. Well, and I'll answer that. I think it's a matter of, in all honesty, some did. I mean, because actually CBS News was the first one to do the story. But I think it is because it's diversity. There are things, if you work in, let's say you work with the economy, you work on Wall Street, things that are in reference to the economy or economics are going to stand out to you, and you're going to follow that. If you're an African American in this country and you see a story like that, it is by nature something that you're going to pay attention to. It has nothing to do with that. That is where your interest lies in some respect. If you're a woman and there is a woman issue, then you are going to be drawn to that story. It's just a diversity issue. So, you know, I agree with you on that comment. But here's what I'd like to know. I heard a Republican commentator on another channel, I'll just be honest, it was Joe Scarborough this morning on MSNBC saying, and so the first time it really clicked with me, if you took the pictures of Trayvon Martin and you transposed them into a 17-year-old white kid, and then you transposed George Zimmerman into a 28-year-old black man that's twice the size, how would you feel about this particular story, and how would it be portrayed? And are you looking for... How would you look for guilt or innocence on the part of each side?
I hear this conversation a lot. Let's be honest. We're not going to be back here in 3 weeks talking about white kids being killed at record numbers. We're not going to be talking about white kids being stopped and frisked in New York City at record numbers. We're not going to come back to CNN and talk about white people being put in prison at record numbers. We know. If we're going to be honest with each other, if we're going to be honest about this country, if we want to walk that elephant out of the room, which is race in this country, let's be honest. And let's at least agree that young black men, young brown men, young Latino men are being targeted in every neighborhood in this country, in every community in this country. I am not going to walk through my neighborhood in Brooklyn tonight, have to worry about the police following me because I look suspicious. It's just not going to happen. Yeah. So yes, if a black man killed a white kid, is it just as wrong? Of course it is. If you racially profile that white kid, of course he is. Of course it is. But that's not going to happen at the numbers it's happening with young black.
Semenology, the Semen Bartender's Handbook by Paul Fotenhauer.
I don't know if I drink it.
And then there's Natural Harvest, also by Paul Fotenhauer.
Okay, guys,
which is cooking with semen.
That's not...
You can get it on Kindle.
Not drink it. No.
Okay. I don't think I'd drink it, but I would eat it.
Or read it for free on Kindle
Does it not
Unlimited.
work as like an emulsifier, like egg?
It would.
It would probably.
Like, or banana.
So you could use it to make a mousse.
You could.
I think there's a picture of like a flan on the cover of the book. It definitely looks like a flan.
I don't think I could eat flan knowing there's semen in it.
But what about brownies? I'm serious about this. If I bake my semen into something, will we eat it for the
you know, fuck yeah,
just poison?
Just
mix it all up.
Just to gain that primal energy from your soul. I mean,
sure. Very virulent, if I might add.
All right.
I used to eat bugs. I'm fine.
I mean, wouldn't be the first semen I ate.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? I mean,
yeah, it's a flan. Okay, cool. Let's eat Leon semen later.
I'll do you a favor, though. I'll drink a lot of pineapple juice before I harvest the samples.
Sweet. Yeah.
I'm not cutting out a second to this. This is gold.
Oh, thanks.
Alrighty, so today we are talking about white privilege. So
we just finished talking about semen. Now we're talking about white privilege. Other white things.
Oh boy. Yeah. So this episode, there's a bunch of white people sitting around the table. I don't know. I'm Irish, German, Scottish.
I'm Ukrainian, Irish, English, Scottish.
I'm Irish, Scottish, Ukrainian.
Yeah.
I grew up my life thinking I was German. Then I did one of those ancestry tests, and turns out I am very much Polish on my father's side.
Oh, there you go.
And
a Jew.
Yeah, I was partially Jewish as well. And then English, Scottish, Irish on my mother's side.
European.
General European, both, Northern European and then like Eastern European.
I just got one of those DNA tests for Christmas. My brother didn't want his DNA in the system, so it's now gonna
all
be
on you now.
mine.
Yeah.
It's all on me.
Okay. You'll have to come back for his DNA episode.
Yeah, and then, but that I'm like half Eastern European, pretty sure, and enough Scottish to make my last name Scottish. But other than that, I do not know.
Nice.
Oh yeah. Yeah. So, like, I wanted to make this focused around like the privileges that like white people get in today's society, and there'll be separate episodes that deal with like injustices and things like that, and we plan on bringing like people of those communities and people of color in to get their perspectives on that, because I think it'd be wrong to do those stories without them. So this episode is going to focus on like the statistical and real privileges that white people get in today's society, and I think it's a very important conversation to have. Yeah, so today I'm not talking about racism. I'm talking about privilege. Now, the reason that white privilege hits people so hard as a word is you're calling a group of people a name that they're not used to being attributed to. Like white people, we generally go through our lives thinking that we're default, like we're normal, stuff like that.
Everyone is white and anyone who's not isn't.
Yeah, exactly. And like being grouped as white is uncomfortable, and also privilege doesn't communicate to people who have gone through hardships or poor rural people like in mid-America and stuff like that. It's not a word that they're used to being applied to. Like they don't feel like they're privileged. So that term just always bucks it.
Yeah.
Now, I want to say that white privilege is not an assumption that white people have not worked hard in their lives. It's not an assumption that they have had it quote unquote easy. It's not an assumption that they have not had struggles. It's just a built-in advantage separate from one's income, effort, and personal struggles.
Right.
Everyone's playing the game we just started on third base.
Yeah.
Well, basically, it's more like, as I kind of understand it, is it's more, that, not that you haven't ever struggled, not that you faced adversity, not that you might be poor or broke or whatever. Yeah. It just means your race is not a reason, your skin color is not a reason for this struggle.
Yeah, you've very rarely ever been victimized for your skin color.
Yeah.
Yeah. And like some people like to think of it in game modes, like normal versus hard mode, but like anybody who's played any number of games know that normal mode can still kick your ass. Like normal mode still has its struggles. You still die a bunch of times. You still understand, like it can still trip you up. Like just because you have one privilege doesn't mean that your life can't have its share of struggles. So that's not what it's saying.
On that note, actually, South Park Fractured But Whole, when you're setting the game difficulty, if you set it to easy, your character's skin gets lighter and lighter and lighter. And as you increase difficulty of the game, it gets darker and darker and darker. So.
Oh, yes. Yeah, always on the precipice, those guys. Yes. An exercise I want to go through is actually something from Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack.
In 1980, I had read 2 essays by black women who had lined it out just like a given. White women are oppressive to work with. And I remembered reading those essays with astonishment. They were so factual about it. White women are oppressive to work with. And I had 2 thoughts in 1980, and I still remembered them. One was, I don't see how they can say that about us. I think we're nice. And second, which is outright racist, but this is where I was in 1980, I especially think we're nice if we work with them. Then I thought, did we fill the reading lists and the programs and women's studies with white people stuff? And at first I said, maybe, and then I said, yes. And I asked myself, if I have anything I didn't earn by contrast with my African-American friends in this building, show me. And I had to pray on it, and I asked my unconscious mind to answer my question. And after 3 months, 46 examples had swum up, most of them in the middle of the night. And if I didn't flick on a light and write them down, they'd be gone by morning, because I didn't want to know them. They were messing up my view of myself as a person who'd earned everything I had.
Yeah, it's good exercise.
Yeah, so I took out the ones that were a little dated, and the ones that kind of don't apply to like people in 2018, and I come up with 21 of these. So we'll take turns reading these out. I'll pass around the table, and just us ourselves and people listening try and keep track of how many of these apply to you or not.
Okay.
So number 1, I can wish to arrange to be in the company of people of my race most of the time.
Yep. Number 2. I can be pretty sure that my neighbors in such a location will be neutral or pleasant to me.
Number 3, I can go shopping alone most of the time, pretty well assured that I will not be followed or harassed.
I can turn on the television or open the front page of the paper and see people of my race widely represented.
I can be sure that my children will be given curricular materials that testify to the experience of their race.
I can go to a music shop and count on finding the music of my race represented.
I can go into a supermarket and find the staple foods which fit with my cultural traditions.
I can go into a hairdresser's shop and find someone who can cut my hair.
I'm 8 for 8 so far.
I'm 8 for 8 as well, yeah.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
I can arrange to protect my children most of the time from people who might not like them.
And that means the ability to be around your children.
I make bad choices without having people attribute these choices to the bad morals, the poverty, or the illiteracy of my race.
I can speak in public to a powerful male group without putting my race on trial.
I can do well in a challenging situation without being called a credit to my race.
Or one of the good ones, as more often is heard.
Yeah.
I'm never asked to speak for all the people of my racial group.
13 for 13.
13, yeah.
I can criticize our government and talk about how much I fear its policies without being seen as a cultural outsider.
I can be fairly sure that if I ask to talk to the person in charge, I will be facing a person of my race.
I can easily buy posters, postcards, picture books, dolls, toys, and children's magazines featuring people of my race.
I can take a job with an affirmative action employer without having coworkers suspect that I got it because of race.
I can be sure that if I need legal or medical help, my race will not work against me.
If my day, week, or year is going badly, I need not ask each of my negative... What? I need not ask each of my negative episode or situation whether it has racial overtones. What?
You don't need to worry that it's because of your race.
I know what it's trying to say. That's just...
Leave bell hooks alone.
It's typed wrong. I blame a typing error.
Okay, the one we skipped was 16?
Yeah.
If a traffic cop pulls me over, or if the IRS audits my tax return, I can be sure I haven't been singled out because of my race.
And then 21, right? I can choose a blemish cover or bandages in a flesh color that matches my skin.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, like, that's an example of something called the...
Can we add up our totals?
Oh, sure. I was at... oh, wait. Do we even have
100%.
100%.
Yeah. You were at 100% too.
Sorry, I'm just checking if I missed a number or not.
I'm pretty sure there was 21. We went around one time, or 4 times, and one plus one.
Yeah.
Yeah, I couldn't find any of those that didn't really apply to me.
No.
Yeah.
100%.
100%.
Yeah. And if you're a person of color, if you're a minority in the country, those things may not apply to you, and those are just little struggles every day that they have to deal with.
Or big. We can't speak for your experience.
Oh yes, like that we don't have to deal with.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it's got to be exhausting to be someone who's not white, or who's not a white man, who's not a white, cis, straight presenting man.
Yeah.
Anything else just got to be tough. Exhausting, having to do that all day, wake up that, go to sleep that, knowing you're always going to be held back because of that. Ooh.
Oh, yeah. So we'll go through, I guess, the history of this idea, so how it evolved through the years. And a man named Webb Du Bois, or William Edward Brugart Du Bois. Du Bois. Yeah, that's probably it. He looked French in his picture, so that could be it.
He looked French in his pictures?
Du Bois.
Me too.
He had a baguette. I don't know.
That's racist.
Pamplemousse.
Boof.
So he did a paper called Black Reconstruction in America, where he described something that white people get paged in that he named a psychological wage. Who would like to read number 4?
Hey. It must be remembered that the white group of laborers, while they received a low wage, were compensated in part by a sort of public and psychological wage. They were given public defense and titles of courtesy because they were white. They were admitted freely with all classes of white people to public functions, public parks, and the best schools. The police were drawn from their ranks, and the courts, dependent on their votes, treated them with such leniency as to encourage lawlessness. Their vote selected public officials, and while this had small effect upon the economic situation, it had great effect upon their personal treatment and the deference shown them. White schoolhouses were the best in the community and conspicuously placed, and they cost anywhere from twice to 10 times as much per capita as the colored schools. The newspapers specialized in news that flattered the poor whites and almost entirely ignored the, pardon this word, Negro, except in crime and ridicule.
And that was in 1935, and that was one of the first examples of anything approaching a discussion surrounding white privilege taking place. The next up was in 1965, Theodore William Allen, who was an anti-racism activist, started a 40-year study of white privilege starting in 1965. His magnum opus at the end of his study period was his 1997 piece called The Invention of the White Race. And reading number 5.
In his work, Allen maintained several points. That the white race was invented as a ruling class social control formation in the late 17th and early 18th century. Anglo-American plantation colonies, principally Virginia and Maryland, that central to this process was the ruling class plantation bourgeoisie conferring white race privileges on European American working people, that these privileges were not only against the interests of African Americans, that they were also poison, ruinous, a baited hook to the class interests of the working people, that white supremacy, reinforced by white skin privilege, has been the main retardant of working class consciousness in the United States, and that struggle for radical social change should direct principal effects at challenging white supremacy and white skin privileges.
Yeah.
And it's basically an argument that in the 16th and 17th centuries, people of Caucasian descent were able to use slave labor of others to accumulate wealth on an unprecedented degree. And that wealth accumulated from that time, and the property brought up at that time, and the investments made, and the inheritance passed down, basically invented the privilege of the white race from that point.
Okay, but also these were probably written by white dudes, right?
Oh, yes. That's a major problem through the history. We'll talk about that later. It's kind of a catch-22, because unfortunately, if you rise up as a white anti-racism activist, you're way more likely to be able to make a living off of it and become famous because of it if you're white.
Or have the opinions that you're espousing taken seriously.
Yeah.
Than if you're an actual person of color who is directly being affected by these things.
Yeah, I will say that these are a lot of the early accounts are being written by white people because a lot of times nobody else could rise above, they're being held down.
Yeah.
In 1975, another step took forward where a feminist pro-gay progressive periodical called Lesbian Tide.
Awesome.
Oh yeah. They published
Lesbian Tide is the name of my new adult rock band.
There we go.
Lesbian Tide.
Adult rock?
Yeah, like slow jams kind of.
Okay.
Yeah. I like to name bands after things that people say.
No. I just wanted to clarify what adult rock was.
Yeah. Like Bryan Adams style.
No, yeah, no.
Lesbian Tide.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, good.
No, totally.
And it was one of the first articles that kind of made the argument that, if you're a feminist, you should be supporting all women, including women of color. And it started to say, a lot of the people who hold the precipums of power within the feminist movement were white women of power.
Yeah. Well, like white feminism nowadays is like a slur. Like you don't want to be a white feminist.
Yeah.
If your feminism isn't intersectional, it isn't worth shit.
Yeah. And of course, intersectional means like you care and work towards the good of all people, not just the people in your own group.
Right.
Yeah.
To be white in so many ways is to be raised to be functionally illiterate on the topic of race. I am white, and part of being white is that I was not raised to see myself in racial terms. I mean, I understood that somebody had race, but not really me. To be white is to see oneself outside of race, to see oneself as a unique, special individual, exempt from the forces of socialization. I'll never forget a moment of standing beside a black man leading a workshop on race, and a white woman said to him, "I don't see color." He said, "Well, then how are you going to see racism?" "Because I am black. I do think you know that, and I have a different experience than you do. And you're not going to be able to understand that, and you're not going to be able to support the parts of that experience that are really painful and problematic if you refuse to acknowledge my reality." I don't see color is really a way of saying I refuse to acknowledge your reality. What's important about that narrative is it reveals what the person thinks racism is. So if the person is using proximity, fondness across race as evidence of a lack of racism, in order for that to be good evidence, a racist must not be able to do that. So that rests on an understanding that a racist cannot tolerate proximity to people of color. And I'm hoping that we can see that's pretty absurd because, trust me, even avowed racists can tolerate being around people of color, and often are. You cannot talk about any other issue without talking about how race informs that issue. And when someone says it's about class, that tends to function as a way to get race off the table. First of all, we're already divided by race. And focusing on race is not what did it. I would say not focusing on race, refusing to grapple with how race shapes virtually everything is what keeps us divided. And that is a very white narrative. All of those narratives function to get race off the table, close the exploration, exempt the person from any further engagement, and protect the racial hierarchy and the white position with it, which is an unequal hierarchy. The challenge I want to offer my fellow white people is changing the question from if to how. So dominant culture asks if I'm racist, and I want to change that question to how have I been shaped by the forces of racism? How is racism manifesting in my life? Because it circulates 24/7, 365. None of us can be and none of us were exempt from its forces. And this is where individualism can come in. I have a particular story, but that story didn't exempt me. And so I can ask myself, how did all the things I see as unique about me set me up into the overall racist structure? Because it did.
Of course, in 1987, put out by, sorry, what was her name again?
Bell Hooks.
Put out by Bell Hooks. The version I read actually was rewritten in the 90s by Peggy Hill. But the original was written by Bell Hooks, and it has gone through various revisions to keep it updated to, like, the people and kids of today. Like, I remember getting something like this in social studies class when I was in 10th grade. And, of course, you know, I was a small-town kid back then. I rejected it wholly. Like, I got angry because of it, and I didn't want to finish the assignment because of it. And that's something we'll talk about later.
How dare you attack my privilege?
Oh, yes.
I'm not privileged.
Oh, I was very much trapped in that mindset.
Yeah.
There's another one that came out in 2003, and all these are pretty recent because this is a pretty recent way to frame things. This is a pretty recent theory, and it's only been talked about in a large amount since the birth of social media, when people have been able to talk about it online. So Ella Bell and Stella Nicomo, who are race relations scholars, did a meta-study in 2003, which they called Our Separate Ways, Black and White Scholars of Race Relations. And they did a meta-study of all their people that they knew in the race relation scholar world, and they estimated that 80% of them basically bought into the concept of white privilege. They thought it was a real thing. They thought it had real evidence, and that was back in 2003. But the same questions were put to the American public in 2003, and less than 17% of people in 2003 believed white privilege was a thing. So that's the basic history. It's very short, but it's only just begun. And now we're going to look at some of the underlying mechanisms, some of the things and actual, I guess, gears and tools that make white privilege happen.
You were right, it's Peggy McIntosh.
Okay.
I was attributing something to bell hooks. Sorry.
Oh, no problem. So the first one is unjust enrichment. So this is white people benefiting from the injustice done to people of color. So an example of this is if people of color are denied housing, say they put about a bunch of suburbs and they book it out and they redline it to make sure that people of color can't get into it. That means you could benefit from that because you could move into one of the houses that's been denied by a person of color. And that's called unjust enrichment. Mm-hmm. It's also seen if less money is spent on areas of the city where people of color live, then you have more money to spend in the areas of the city that more white people live.
And gerrymandering.
Yes, that's another one. The other one is something called whiteness unspoken, or the unspoken advantage of bias, which means that you're given the benefit of the doubt because you're white. Me and my partner, we went to Walmart recently, and we got a couple things out of the locked case. And the guy had to run around the corner to get something. And we were holding a couple of games and looking at them, reading the back, and he dipped around the corner. And it was in the middle of me researching for this. And he said, I trust you. I don't think you guys will steal anything. Why did he think that? He just met us.
Yeah.
Why did he think that we wouldn't run away with those games? And part of me wondered, like, if I was a person of color, would he have locked those games back up and then left?
Mm-hmm.
And that's kind of like, you benefit from the unspoken, like, a benefit of the doubt.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Another one is called disparate injustice. So that's where you as a white person are not subject to the injustice as much as a person of color might be. So in New York, in the 1990s, there was a big thing that was overturned about stop and frisk, which is basically saying that if a person looks suspicious, you can stop them and search them without a warrant, as long as they don't mention that you need a warrant.
It's just paranoia, more or less. You don't never know what's gonna happen. Like today, it could be I go to jail and I stay in there for 3 days and then come out and then have to go through the whole legal process of suing the police, or they just let me go. It's always that touch and go kind of feeling. Because I know no matter what I say to them, no matter how innocent I may be, they can still arrest me.
Practice of stop and frisk disparately impacts Black and Latino communities and aggressively targets Black and Latino communities. 9 times out of 10, it's a young Black and Latino male who's being stopped, questioned, and frisked. 9 times out of 10, it's a young Black and Latino male being let off the hook, not giving a summons, not being arrested, not being found with any kind of drugs, paraphernalia, or weapons. When you look at the intent of the program, and when you look at what it actually delivers, it's not effective, right? You can't work anywhere else in this city, in any agency, be wrong 90% of the time and argue that what you're doing is effective and proper, because it's not. The cool thing about Keishan, is one of those young people that was willing to open up and share his story. And then what struck me most was when we asked, or when young people asked, how many times would you say you were stopped over your lifetime? And he said, over the last few years in my teenage life, I would say that I've been stopped over 100 times. And so they had re-asked the question and said, did you say over 100 times? How many times would you say you were stopped? And he said, I told you, over 100 times. This is like normal. This is my life. This is what happens.
So basically they were they were violating people's privacy, and they were overcoming their rights. And as long as they didn't bring their rights up, they didn't need to enforce them and stuff like that.
Don't we do that now?
Oh, yeah.
They still do,
like
yeah.
Against Saskatoon?
Yeah, that's how it is.
Yeah.
The Saskatchewan Police Commission actually released a policy on it, and it's basically one of those race won't be a motivating factor when we stop and harass people for minding their own damn business.
Yeah.
Is basically what the policy is. And it's like, yeah, sure, okay.
Yeah.
Totally isn't.
Yeah.
To speak of privilege, I was once at a house party on the west side of Saskatoon, which is the more impoverished area. I wanted to walk from this party back to my car downtown, which is about a 20-minute walk.
Yeah.
And I was told by two Indigenous gentlemen at the party that I couldn't make that walk by myself. I'd get jumped. And they offered me, after one more drink, to walk me back to my car in downtown, and then I'd drive them back to the party.
Yeah.
And we were in the vicinity of Avenue B and 21st Street, walking through the crosswalk. A police car rolled up beside us, two white officers inside, rolled down the window, looked at me, and said, "Are they with you?"
Oh, no.
Oh, yeah.
I quickly replied, "Yes." And he said, "Carry on," and off the cop car went.
Oh, yeah.
Because they were looking after you.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. There's a couple I recently met, and the wife in the couple recently told me a few stories about, like, her husband is a very tall Indigenous gentleman. I guess he doesn't even look that imposing. He looks like a big cuddly bear to me, but she says there's been half a dozen incidents where they're walking down the street and a policeman will either pull over or flick his lights on and ask her if she's okay, is that your husband, and stuff like that. Like, her walking beside her tall Indigenous husband was enough to, like, sound the alarms for those police officers that chose to.
No, not a white woman with an Indigenous man.
Yeah, and that's an example of whiteness unspoken, kind of like...
Yeah.
Like, we don't have to deal with, like, random, like, discriminatory bullshit like that because we're given the benefit of the doubt.
Yeah.
So spirit and justice. So another example of that is if people of color are being the main focus of the police, then even if you're doing illegal shit as a white person, there's less scrutiny and less time put upon you.
Yeah, what did they say at the end of New York's stop and frisk? They said that if they stopped an average black person, they were much less likely to have weapons and drugs than the average white person.
Yep.
Like, you would get more shit off the street by street checking white people, and they still didn't do it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah, I think on average, white people smoke cannabis at a higher degree than African-American people, and yet African-American people are arrested far more than white people, even when per capita is implied.
Yep.
Yeah. Another one is framing racial equality. So this is basically a block to conversations. So when you talk about white privilege with white people, like in school or anything like that, it's often met with hostility and silence. That was like me in 10th grade.
Yeah.
When I didn't want to hear it, I didn't want to hear that what I thought I was being told is that I was a bad person and that I was lazy and, like, not talented, and that's what I thought I was being told.
When somebody tells me that they don't see race, I say, I mean, that's fine. You know, you can choose not to see the sky, but it exists. I'm told I was 4 years old when I turned to my mum and I said, well, you know, when am I going to turn white? I was consuming and engaging with media and culture around me, a lot of cartoons, a lot of kids' TV, comics, etc., and well, all the good people were white, and I considered myself to be a good person. I realized at that early age that to be white was to be human. I was attempting to discuss race in white-dominated circles and really getting nowhere. I wrote a blog post. I titled it, "Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race." Let's say we were having a broad conversation about inequality. As soon as I tried to raise the topic of race, there was an almost immediate clampdown, shutdown, denial from my conversation partner. They tried to find ways to convince me that absolutely no, race had nothing to do with it, that actually I had a chip on my shoulder, and that, you know, why was I trying to make everything about race? I'd actually decided to have a conversation with a person who I can now confidently say probably is a white anti-racist, a white critical anti-racist. And I spoke to her about her journey and I said, well, what's led to you being somebody who is so aware of how race shapes inequality? She said that a lot of her defensiveness initially when it came to these conversations about race was a fear of being wrong. You know, a fear of, she said a lot of it was to do with her ego, a fear of being implicated in existing inequalities, a fear that she actually wasn't doing enough. I know that I have not spoken out in the past for fear of losing a job or losing a friend or losing a space in a house share Because when you discuss race in the conversation, you become the troublemaker, you become the problem. I dedicated a whole chapter in the book to discussing intersectionality, and it's really from the perspective of my doomed encounters with white British feminism. And they were really doomed because I was surrounded by very nice, white, middle-class women who just didn't want to hear about race. And I was told I'm splitting the movement, I'm being divisive, etc., etc., etc. And that was really a galling time for me because I don't really have the option of separating these two issues. In Britain, power is still very white here. Black and minority ethnic people are about 14% of the population, but that definitely is not reflected in the corridors of power, in who shapes culture, who shapes politics, who shapes the arts. No one's asking the gatekeepers to examine their own prejudices and ask, well, why aren't you recruiting people who are not like you and not from your background? I heard a great quote, and I can't remember who said it, but the person said, you know, you can't ask me why I haven't been invited to the party. You have to ask the host.
After hearing about white privilege, it was found in a study that the white people that went through that, kind of learning about it, they're more likely to agree with racist opinions than non-racist opinions than they were before they took the class.
Yeah.
It's almost like a drawing back, like a kickback. And that comes from when they hear that about white privilege and they hear about inequality, they think that that inequality has nothing to do with them and nothing to do with them as a person or as a representative. So by framing it as a not me, not white people issue, they think that they don't have to deal with it or think about it or put any effort into it. So it's kind of put at the back of their mind. Also, there's this concept of white fragility. So this is something that's seen in universities today. So even in modern universities, in classes taught about white privilege and stuff like that, words like urban, inner city, disadvantaged, which are kind of charged words that hold racial overtones, are used 3 times as much as white privileged or whiteness. So, like, you can tell that the words are being formed to the audience, even in universities.
Interesting.
Yeah, to protect the feelings of anybody in the audience. They may have lashback, hostility, discomfort, and all that. And this it's kind of like a censorship and kind of like a regression to problematic words and problematic thought, just to protect like the
white people, the well-meaning white people from their feelings being heard.
Yeah.
Which shouldn't even be a consideration.
Yeah.
So because I write about race on my blog, on social media, I write about it very openly, very directly. There are times when I get emails from hurt white people who are basically telling me that they feel like I'm being divisive or they're misunderstood. Basically, it's white fragility in email form. And in those times, I have to let them know that, one, I'm not writing for white people, I'm writing to you sometimes, though. And my truth is my truth. So me being very pro-black sometimes is not me being anti-white. Part of the problem with race in the U.S. and racism is that we aren't having these open conversations, these real conversations that aren't steeped in super polite words and sentences. We need to be talking to each other, and that's what I hope I do. And I get messages from white readers who say, you know what, you've actually made me think about this differently. If you are a writer with a strong point of view, you will always ruffle certain feathers. There's no way everyone's going to agree with whatever you say all the time. It's just not possible. And for me, what's important about my writing is I have to make sure I say it like I mean it, I don't say it from a place of hate, and I can defend my words. If I can say yes to all of those things and say yes, I said that with love, yes, I can absolutely defend it, yes, I meant it, then yeah, I say it, and then I see what happens.
Yeah, so those are kind of the gears and levers of that. Now we're going to look at some of the numbers, some of the hard numbers, the stats. So wealth. So wealth in this context is determined as the total value of everything minus debts. So that's everything earned from work, inheritance, interests, assets, side hustles, whatever.
Yeah.
So through the years, white people have had more ability to accumulate wealth. So Social Security is an example. They were excluded. Social Security included jobs that a lot of white people had, and a lot of African American people and people of color. The jobs that they had were not included in Social Security. A lot of the low-paying jobs, so they were excluded from Social Security. They didn't get military awards and accolades, which also often come with promotions, raises, and cash prizes. They had a continuing accumulation of tax-light inheritances. So white people were able to pass their money down through generations almost tax-free by lobbying the government and making it that way. So they were able to protect that large amount of wealth they built, like back in times when slavery was still a thing. And they also have more investing and savings options. So banks will do more things for them. And banks will take more risk with them, even if their credit is the exact same. And also, with that wealth, they've had more time to buy land, property, and those just rise in value over time. Like land bought in like the early 1900s is worth hundreds of times more than it was back then today.
Right.
All that accumulated wealth means that the average white family in America in 2009, and it's only gotten worse since then, the inequality, was $236,000 above the average person of color's family in 2009.
Yikes.
Yes. So another one, employment. So white people have had more access to employment along with success in employment. So a big meta-study that a lot of people have heard of is called, Are Emily and Greg More Employable Than Lakeisha and Jamal?
Oh, yeah, I read that one, yeah.
So basically, tens of thousands of resumes with identical information were sent out. The only difference is that they changed the name to like generic top 10 white people names to the most popular statistical names in people of color neighborhoods. They tried to make it, and they sent it to 6 different cities to hundreds of employers. And they found that across the 6 different cities, you had anywhere from a 50% to a 78% more likely chance of getting a call back if you sent the resume with
a white name
compared to, like I said, if you sent with
an unfamiliar name.
Yeah, Emily and Greg versus Lakeisha and Jamal.
Foundation. The study, Are Emily and Greg More Employable Than Lakeisha and Jamal?, done by Marianne Bertrand and Senthil Malaton, was a study regarding whether your name influences future employers when they receive your resume rather than your qualifications. The measure of economic success highlights racial inequality in the labor force. In comparison to Caucasians, African Americans are twice as likely to be unemployed and earn nearly 25% when they are employed. The researchers would conduct a study regarding the measure of racial discrimination in the labor market regarding names. They looked for help wanted ads in Boston and Chicago newspapers and would respond with fake resumes. Every resume they would submit would include a very African American sounding name or a very white sounding name. The results showed a very significant degree of discrimination. For Caucasian names, they found that they received 50% more callbacks. Also, those participants who lived in better neighborhoods received more callbacks, but they did not differ by race. They also found that federal contractors and employers who say equal opportunity employer in their ad discriminate as much as other employers. African Americans have to send 15 resumes for one callback, whereas white names send 10 resumes for one callback, which is a 50% callback gap rate. Based on their estimates, white names yield as many more callbacks as an additional 8 years of experience.
A 2003 study it was basically a study in a trade school. So this was a school that was sending out plumbers, electricians, stuff like that. They did a study of all their graduates, and it was a meta-racial study where they were tracking the people of color and the Caucasians as they went forward in their careers. So they came out of school with the exact same experience, the exact same education, and they kept up with them through the years. And the white people were employed 48% more frequently. They received promotions twice as much, and their wages were on average 36% above.
Yikes.
Yeah. And that's with the same experience in the same job markets, all that good stuff. Mm-hmm. Housing is another one. So in 1934, the Federal Housing Act basically made it so that they wanted to get America to own homes. Mm-hmm. Communism was a big thing that they were fighting against back then, kind of the rise of the red and all that, and they believed that, oh, God damn it, you got to own your home, you got to own your property, because that's the only way and all that. And it was a big push against communism for some big reason. Didn't really make sense. But anyways, the government gave a bunch of credits to citizens to buy homes and to put those initial investments down on homes. Where it ran into problems is they gave the power to distribute those to people who had complete power to deny people based on race.
Right.
And this is where the term redlining came in. So they started redlining these neighborhoods where people of color lived, and they started saying none of these people who live here get any house credits. And basically it channeled literally tens of millions of dollars from potential projects that could enrich like people of color's homes and neighborhoods back into rich white suburbs. And yeah. And of course, because they were able to buy houses, property values only rise in value. So a home that was worth $30,000 in 1970 is worth $600,000 today.
Yeah.
So that wealth has just shot through the roof. So all those things through this Federal Housing Act, it kept on chugging all the way up until 1994. So from 1934 to 1994, it was perfectly acceptable to deny somebody based on race. And literally, like hundreds of thousands of homes were denied from people of color and given to white people.
Yuck.
Yeah. And on top of that, even if they get approved for this, even if they get approved for a home loan, if they have identical credit and identical work history, mortgage places often gave higher mortgage rates to people of color than to white people. So white people got better mortgage rates.
Yep.
And houses were valued more if the owners inside them were white. So it was an actual part of the equation back then.
How much melanin you had in your skin.
Yeah, determined, and that increased and decreased the house price by as much as 20%.
Yuck.
Imagine your house going down in value by 20% because you're black.
Ooh.
Like Christ. Also, military. So America, of course, has had lots of military outings, and white privilege came forth in them as well.
White supremacy did too.
Yeah, it definitely did.
yeah. That wasn't as much as a mistake as a sidebar.
No.
Okay. So soldiers who were people of color were 38% more likely to be placed in positions of higher danger. So there's certain places in a military line or in a formation that have
Operation Get Behind the Darkies.
Yes.
Like in South Park.
Yeah, from South Park.
Cutting edge.
Yeah, and these are soldiers with the same experience, like the same, like across the board. They did all their stuff, and they were 38% more likely to be put in more dangerous positions, which of course results in higher deaths. And there was actually a 2013 study put forward by the military that said that white Christian heterosexual men had such a power hold and such a boys' club in the military in 2013 that they were looking for solutions to break it up. And they were starting to hire, like, officers that whole job were to create equal opportunity because the military had become such a white heterosexual Christian male boys' club.
Boys' club.
Yeah. Another one is education. So if you're a Oh, wait, that's right. So, if you're white, you're 18% more likely to get on the honors roll, even if you have the exact same grades. That goes for college and university, from honors roll to the dean's list.
Yeah.
Across the board, you're about 18% more likely, even with exact same grades. In 2008, there was a study done at a bunch of universities where identical essays were labeled with, generic white names and Jamal and, like, generic people of color names. And there was an average of an 8% difference in marks from the white people's essays to the people of color's essays.
Mm-hmm.
And that was done in schools that range all the way from Texas to California. It didn't seem to change based on location. And of course, the education is tied in with housing. So if you have a lot of places in America, how housing works is the property taxes from an area fund the schools. So if you have a bad, poor neighborhood with not a lot of income, your schools are going to get worse. You're going to have lower paid teachers. You're going to have worse facilities. You're going to have less supplies. You're going to have less tutors and TAs, less extracurricular activities. And depending on where you live, you may not have the heating or cooling needs you need to make school comfortable.
Yeah.
And of course, worse schools come out with lower graduation rates, which means that people can't get scholarships, can't get into college. And because of the poverty already seen, that white people don't have to deal with, they have a less chance of going to higher education, making more money, stuff like that. You're also less likely to be arrested in the legal system. So people of color make up about 30% of the total population in the U.S., but they make about 69% of the U.S. prison population. So that's a big discrepancy. It's particularly apparent when it comes to nonviolent drug offenses. So nonviolent drug offenses means usually either possession or distribution. So they have enough drug that they have for their own personal use, or they have a large amount of a drug. Only 14% of people of color use drugs regularly, over 49% of those arrested for drugs are people of color.
Wow.
Yeah. And it's actually 18% of white people use drugs regularly, but represent...
Hi, hello.
Yes.
Not me. Just kidding.
They call
like all of us.
They called the weed drugs.
Yeah.
Anyway.
They called the weed drugs.
Yeah.
That's all. That's the only drug I use.
Yeah.
It's legal now.
Yeah.
Get off my ass.
It is legal now. Get off my ass.
And also, they did some flashing face studies in 2014, which means you get to see a face for about half a second and it flashes away, and then you have to give your opinion on the face.
How's that fair?
It basically tries to remove bias by not giving you enough time to think of a more acceptable answer. You kind of just have to blurt out the first thing that comes to your mind.
Okay.
And they go through a couple hundred faces. It was shown that across the line, like they colored people of color white, and they colored white people like darker colored skin, just so like facial structure wouldn't like take into accord. And they also used like actual representatives, actual people of color and white people and all that. And they mixed it all together, and they saw across the line, the darker the skin, the more likely you were likely to be labeled a thug, a criminal, angry, ignorant, or lazy.
Yuck.
Yeah. And yeah.
I hate that.
Yeah, and something that relates all the way back to episode 1, actually.
Yeah.
You're more likely to make headlines if you're white.
Oh, yeah.
So there's a myth out there that there's no African-American serial killers. There's a ton of them. It's just that newspapers never print them.
Yeah.
Because, like, serial killers usually choose to kill people of their own race.
Yeah.
And newspapers don't care about stories where, like, an African-American person is just killing a bunch of other African-American people.
Yuck.
And it's kind of like they don't even care about that. And if you go missing or if you're murdered, you're way more likely to A, make the paper, or B, even be featured in the paper if you're white.
Well, that's why I'm going to be doing an episode on missing and murdered Indigenous women coming up here.
I guess, like, I don't want anybody to go away from this episode thinking I just, like, beat up on all your accomplishments and, like, I just called you down because of your skin color and all that. It's a useful thing to have in mind. It's a useful thing to think about when you think about all the things you've got and earned and, like, the big perspective of it. Yeah. I don't know, does anybody else have anything around the table they'd like to add?
I'm super privileged and I'm white.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm quite privileged and also white.
Yeah.
I have so much privilege.
Yeah. And, like, we've all gone through struggles. Like, I know the 3 hosts have mental health issues. And, like, I know 4. Yeah. And, like, we've all gone through struggles, and we've all had dark times and light times, and, like, what I want to get through here is, like, normal mode can still kick your ass. Like, normal mode isn't easy.
Yeah.
It's just, it can be a struggle, and it can be heartbreaking, and it can be horrible all the way. It's just, it's not horrible because of your race most of the time.
Yeah.
It's just, if you happen to be a person of color or a minority group, you just have you have more hurdles to jump over.
Yeah.
I just sent you a YouTube video from Tim Weiss on white privilege.
Oh, yeah?
Hack it up, stick it in.
Oh, yeah, will do. Okay. We'd love to know opinions on this, because really, at the end of the day, this is a bunch of white people sitting around. So
if you're a person of color, please, like, rip us a new one.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, we need it from time to time.
Yeah, like, there's been a couple after shows where we just talk about one episode, and I think this one's an important enough topic. I'd love to read some emails about this and gain some more perspective.
Yeah.
Yeah, so ovfeedback@gmail.com. I've been Ood Gallifrey.
Sage Murray.
Leon Filger.
And in studio with us,
Carly.
And Richard Bigley.
Thank you, and have a good night.
Cheers.
Love you, bye.
Hello, everyone. So just as Leon suggested, I'm going to play a 9-minute segment of Tim Wise from his talk on white privilege. I want to leave you with his summary of how white privilege was created and how it is still used in society. And I think he says it far better than I ever could. So enjoy and see you guys in the after show.
Because if you know the history of the whole concept of whiteness, if you know the history of the whole concept of the white race, where it came from and for what reason, you know that it was a trick and it's worked brilliantly. See, prior to the mid to late 1600s in the colonies of what would become the United States, there was no such thing as the white race. Those of us of European descent did not refer to ourselves by that term really ever before then. In fact, in the old countries of Europe, we had spent most of our time killing each other. We didn't love each other. We weren't one big happy family. The side of my family that comes from Scotland, hell, they didn't even worry about fighting people outside of Scotland. Highlanders and Lowlanders just fought the hell out of each other. So there was no white race, but in the colonies of what would become the United States, what did we see in the 1660s, 1670s? We began to see that Africans of indentured servant status, many of them not enslaved yet, they were not necessarily permanently enslaved. Some were, others were indentured like many poor Europeans for periods of 7 to 11 years. They could work off their indenture and then they would be free labor technically. Realized, as did the white indentured servants, the Europeans who hadn't even been called white yet, that they had a lot of things in common, like the fact that they were all getting their clock cleaned by the elite. And so they would get together more than our history books taught us, to foment rebellion against the elite, to try to get a better deal for themselves on the basis of economic necessity and economic justice. And what did the elite do? When you see that you're outnumbered by black and white folks who are penniless, landless, peasants, you have to do one of two things. You either have to kill them all, but you can't do that because who's going to work? Rich folks weren't going to. They had to get poor people to work. The whole point was to be a person of leisure back in those days. That was the goal, was not to work. So you couldn't kill them all. You didn't want to kill them all. You had to do the work yourself. You had to build your own levee, build your own house. No. Pick your own tobacco, harvest your own cotton. No, we're not going to do any of that. So you can't kill them, but you can co-opt them. And so the elite in Virginia, for example, in the colony, begins to give certain carrots to people of European descent, saying things like, you know, we're going to let you own a little land. Not much, but just a little. And we're going to get rid of indentured servitude. Now you're free labor. And by the way, once you're free labor, you get 50 acres of land just because you're free labor, see? So we're going to cut you in on this deal. We're going to let you enter into contracts. We're going to let you testify in court. And here's the best of all. We're going to put you on the slave patrol to keep those people in line, right? The idea was you're still going to get your clock clean. We still don't like you. We still aren't going to really empower you or change your economic subordination, but we're going to make you honorary members of this team, and you're going to help us keep those other people down. And so they got a little taste of power, and it did effectively divide and conquer those coalitions. Those rebellions began to stop almost instantly. Fast forward to the Civil War era, you have rich white folks in the South, where I come from, standing up and openly admitting that the reason they're prepared to secede from the Union, and the only reason they ever articulated publicly, ever, was to maintain and extend slavery and white supremacy not only where it already existed, but into the newly acquired, that is to say, stolen territories from Mexico to the west. That was what they said. Now we lie about it. We say it wasn't about slavery, that it was about states' rights. Yes, the right of the states to keep and maintain slaves, exactly. But back then they had no shame, so they didn't try and cover it up. They openly said it, but once again, the rich didn't want to go do the work. Are you kidding? No. They're going to get poor people to go fight for them. And the poor folks didn't even own slaves. Now think, how do you get poor people who don't even own the shirt on their back, let alone slaves, to go fight to keep your slaves for you? You've got to convince them that their skin is more important than their economic interest. Because think about it, if I am a farmer who has to charge you $1 a day or $2 a week to work on your farm, and harvest that tobacco or pick that cotton, but you can get a black person to do it for free because you own them, who's going to get the job? Not me. In other words, slavery actually undermined the wages and the wage base, the economic floor of the typical white working class or low income person. But they were told If these people are freed, they're going to take your job. No, fool, they got your job. That's the point. And so at some level, again, working class white people being harmed by white privilege, relatively being advantaged, right? Being given a leg up, being given a membership to the club, but in absolute terms being kept economically subordinated by the very thing that gave them a sense of superiority. How's that for irony? Then in the present era, this hasn't stopped. This is not ancient history. Now we have people running around insisting that we should close the border with Mexico because if we don't, the wages of working class people will continue to fall. The implication being that the only reason workers are paid like crap in this country is because the border is open. But if you believe that, you would actually have to believe that if that border were closed, that all these owners of capital and industry would just say, oh, well, you figured us out. Here, it's a raise. Do we really believe that the only thing keeping bosses from paying people more is the presence of low-wage, medium, semi-skilled labor from south of this artificial border? Is that really what we believe? We know that if that border is closed, it isn't going to be closed to capital. It isn't going to be closed to goods. If you have a border that can be crossed by capital looking for the highest return on investment or goods looking for the highest price, but labor is chained to its country of origin, how is that going to work to the benefit of working people? By definition, it doesn't. By definition, it immiserates the working class. Divide and conquer. But the best example of all, perhaps, in the contemporary era, in the greater New Orleans area after Katrina. Here you have two communities that were the most hard hit. The lower Ninth Ward, mostly black community, 94% African American, about 40% official poverty rate, heavy working class community. And right across the canal, St. Bernard Parish, Chalmette, 95% white, also working class, high levels of poverty, economically very similar. And at the end of the day, in those first few days of September 2005, more similar than they probably would have realized. Because when those levees broke, they all got their stuff jacked. They all got their stuff destroyed. But if you had asked white folks in Chalmette, and I've done it, who was the cause of the problems in the greater New Orleans area prior to that flooding, they would have pointed across that canal at those black folks, wouldn't have called them black folks, and would have said, there, that's the problem. 70% of the white folks in St. Bernard Parish voted for David Duke, white supremacist, neo-Nazi, former head of the largest Ku Klux Klan group in the United States when he ran for governor in 1991. 7 out of 10 gladly voted for him because he was blaming black folks for all of their problems, and they bought it. What's the irony? The irony is that while they were blaming black people for their problems, while they were blaming black people for the conditions of the greater New Orleans area in which they lived, nobody was paying attention, least of all they, to the fact that these white elite politicians, either in Baton Rouge or in Washington, whose job it was to secure those levees, to make sure that levy funds were spent in the proper way and that they were spent at all, those mostly white and mostly elite politicians did nothing. At the end of the day, it wasn't just the black folks in the lower Ninth Ward they didn't care about. They really couldn't have given a rat's ass about those poor and working class white folks either. And yet, when the people of Chalmette, people of St. Bernard Parish got back into session, first time they had a city council meeting, parish council meeting after the flooding, the lights aren't even on yet. The water isn't even hooked up. And the first order of business was to pass an ordinance saying that you couldn't rent property in St. Bernard Parish to anyone who wasn't a blood relative. Now, I'll leave it to your imagination as to why you'd want to pass a law. That law had never existed before, but now that it's been emptied out and you don't know who might come back, that's a damn good way to keep black people out, isn't it? Because if you're 95% white to begin with, if you pass an ordinance that says that, that's a great, you can't say no blacks need apply, you can't say no blacks allowed, but that was an ingenious way to get around the law. Now, they got caught, there was a lawsuit threatening, they got rid of the ordinance, but my point in bringing it up is to say, once again, divide and conquer is working. These white folks in Chalmette need to march across that canal and join hands with the black folks who've been sitting there more than willing to work with them for an awful long time and march on Baton Rouge and march on D.C. and march on the Corps of Engineers and recognize their commonality of interest. But the whiteness and the lure of whiteness has tricked these have nothing in their bank account white people into believing that they got more in common with the rich white folks on St. Charles Avenue that didn't lose anything in that flooding than they have in common with the black working class folks who live about 500 yards away.
So Occultae Veritatis podcast has become semi-successful. A lot of people listen to us and download us, and it's great to be in so many people's ears. We're still super small fry compared to some of the big guys, but, we have a loyal group of fans, and really that's thanks to, in part, people who took a chance on us and played their ads on their podcasts and spread the word of mouth, and I thought today I'll give a little back. So here's promos from 3 shows I listened to. I'm going to say goodbye for here and play the little outie dune, and then you can hear those ads. Feel free to give them a listen if you need some more podcasts in your life. Otherwise, thank you for letting us into your ears again, and I will see you next week. Goodbye, lovelies. Hail Val.
Hello friends, we are the Ladies of Strange. I'm Ashley.
I'm Tiffany.
And I'm Rebecca. Have you ever wondered if Jenny's head really did fall off when they removed the green ribbon?
Or if aliens are hiding in the tails of comets waiting to take us away?
Or if there's any scientific basis to the Ouija board?
Well then don't risk your search history and join us each Thursday as we discuss
the history, mystery, and theory
of all things questionable, odd, and eerie. For links to where you can stream episodes and see blog posts on the subjects we cover, head over to our website, theladiesofstrange.com.
Keep it strange, lovelies.
Hello, and welcome to Nothing Ever Happens in Canada, and I'm Canadian Girl. This is a Canadian podcast looking to explore the myths, the legends, and just good old tales Canada has to tell. I may not be as dark as these guys, but I do have a couple stories to keep you entertained. A murder, some ghosts, sunken ships, and I'm currently working on a UFO case out of Shag Harbor, Nova Scotia. Join me as we discover some of Canada's most interesting stories over here at Nothing Ever Happens in Canada. You can find me on most of your podcast apps, Apple Podcasts, Google, Spotify, and more. I'm Canadian Girl. I hope you'll join me on my next adventure.
Welcome to the Woods, a podcast about the mysterious, the legendary, and the plain weird.
The one time Satan keeps his promise and you're not allowed into heaven.
Yeah. Western style buffalo.
Like, how creepy is that?
I'm sorry, but what? This is terrifying. It'll be fun because, I'm already dead. What's gonna happen to me?
Because you never know what you'll find in the woods.
Alrighty, that's it. That's all. See you next week. Don't lick any poles. Keep your feet warm.